Hello, imaginary friends, and welcome to the Imaginaries Literary Podcast. Hi again, imaginary friends. Thank you for tuning in to this one. This is my story today that we'll be reading. It's called Ungeschlossen, or Unlocked, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you can sleep tonight.
When Lina was 11, her Opa Karl had a stroke. He had expected it for some time, talked about having one as one talks about an appointment.
When I have my stroke, Schatzi, you'll have to remember to take the rubbish,
he'd said to his wife. When it came, it only surprised him in coming so late. He'd been 94, and he'd been talking about it 40 years or more. He was in a coma for several days, during which all of the people who knew him well, and said they cared for him anyway, came to visit him at home. He'd been the sort of person, they all said, that one didn't always like, but liked having round. And one of them dared to say that things were even better now, because Opa Karl was there, but had nothing to say. You see, they didn't have to listen to comparisons between Platonism and antediluvian aboriginal mythologies, or between the political landscape of the Seleucid Empire and our own. And best of all, they didn't have to bear the apparent randomness of his compliments and reproofs. Now they could simply look at his pleasant face and greet him without worrying that to greet him was to open a door they could not shut. They sometimes stayed late and ate Brazilian food and drank drinks from everywhere else, and they talked about Opa Karl, but mostly other things he would not approve of, while the man himself lay in the next room breathing in and out. Lina did not like it. She hadn't always liked Opa, but he hadn't deserved to be mocked. So instead of sitting in this room, with the laughing, drinking, flailing, two living adults, Lina sat next to Opa, in that room, in a straight-backed chair next to the one dim lamp, looking everywhere but his face. It was very quiet here. Lina didn't really like sitting here either, but she felt that here, somewhere between the yellow lamp and Opa and the perfect sheets, was a something about to happen, and that it was frightening and wonderful and would not let her go. She tried talking to Opa to pass the time, but he never said anything, as they said he would not, and the longer he said nothing, the more certain she was that it was about to happen, that she would look at him and he would begin talking in a new and horrible way, and so she became nervous and talked more and more herself and more about nonsense. At length she stood up, carefully, shaking, and went to the next room and round the unquiet table, and no one stopped her going upstairs. She was alone upstairs. She was surrounded by empty spaces and lightly dusted odd things that didn't appear to belong anywhere, but which hadn't moved in some time. She turned on all of the lights, but it still seemed dark, as if all the rooms were dark by nature and only pretending to be lit. She decided that looking closely at everything would banish this thought, so she took several items to the bottom of the stairs, where she could look at them unseen but within hearing. There was an old cello bow, a pipe that smelled really pleasant, a book that wasn't in German so she couldn't read it, but which had a quaint-looking mountain village etched on the cover, a rusted old bell that was nearly too large to carry, and a fencing sabre with a frayed golden tassel tied to the pommel. After a few dozen careful slashes through the air, Lina grew bored enough that the something about to happen clawed at her mind, and she put the things down. She made her way back to the room where Opa lay, giving the guests a not very subtle and decidedly evil eye. She paused at the door, shutting her eyes, and when she opened it, Opa didn't sit up suddenly and say something shocking in a ghostly voice, so she opened her eyes again. Whatever the it was, it hadn't happened yet. Opa lay still and quiet, breathing in and out.
Don't,
he suddenly said, but only in her memory.
Don't take that kitten from its mother's milk.
And another time,
don't laugh about that boy's hurt knee.
And
don't climb on the sofa's back. I'm too old to stop you falling.
And
don't open the curio.
The curio. Ah. She rushed back to the stairs and stared up to the top, to the landing, where the curio stood in half shade, just touched by a beam from one of the lights out of view. The curio was a cabinet with a triangular shape, so that it fit in a corner, and it had stood in this corner all her life, and she had scratched it from memory, because one day she had asked about it.
"Why is it all made of glass, but there is nothing in it to look at?"
and Opa had warned her especially sternly.
Do not open this thing.
And he had looked at her long and hard to make sure she understood, and then he had added,
And if you find it open, shut it. And certainly do not open the drawer inside it.
And then she had nodded, so that he knew he didn't have to glare at her like that any more. And he went on doing it, and then he added one thing more, gripping her cheeks in his huge hands.
And do not promise me on your life that you will not ever touch what is inside the drawer.
She had believed Opa because he never bluffed, and because he did not normally touch people, and because there was nothing else in the 2-meter cabinet. And she had been frightened enough at the time. But now, today, she looked up at the curio, and the door stood open. It had never been open. Never. She had not opened it, but she could not escape the conclusion that it was open for a reason, that the curio, grappling with its invisible chains now that Opa was laid up, had popped open of its own volition. Lina stood at the foot of the stair, looking at it. She told herself that she was merely looking, but really she was stacking up her courage to go and inspect the open thing. And when she began to move, foot on step, next foot on next step, up the staircase, she had to admit what she was going to do. And then she needed a reason why. And the reason became that it was her duty. Now he was probably dying, she decided she cared for Opa Karl, that nobody else did in quite the same way, and that only she would even think to look after something so evidently important to him as a mutinous door. But you see, once she had actually reached the open glass door, she put her hand on it and didn't shut it. Instead, she let her eye fall inside the cabinet and find the tiny seam where the bronze-coloured drawer, one of the only bits that was not made of glass, met the shelf above it. It was not much of a seam. She would never see inside it like this. And now she needed a reason to touch the drawer, not to open it, you see, but really to make certain it was entirely shut. But how can one be sure of that without a little force? And how can one apply force in one direction without beginning in the other? She had to open it just a little in order to shut it. Only, once she had got up the courage to do it, the drawer was stuck. It could not have been locked because there was no lock to speak of. She tugged harder at it. It didn't budge. She took a breath. Certainly she didn't want to shut the curio door and walk away, though that was precisely what she had pretended to be doing. But now she would have done it at last, if not for the wheedling voice of one of Opa Karl's more or less friends, saying,
"Oh, yes, he was a wonderful teacher, or at least a lot of people loved him. Of course, you can't pretend that relationship has anything to do with learning."
Lina wasn't sure what it meant, but condescension is a language everybody knows. Somehow this gave her the necessary strength, and she dug in, tore at the drawer's handle, and nearly tipped the cabinet over her frail body and down the stairs. After a frightening wobble, though, it righted, and she stood with the now separated bronze drawer in her hands, peering down inside it, at a key. There was nothing in the drawer, just a simple, heavy, black key. Probably the key to the cabinet. This is what she assumed at the time, though she was wrong. When everybody had gone home, Lina remained with her Vati, Mutti, Oma, and they gathered round Opa's bed and said a prayer. It seemed obvious that the something about to happen would happen then, but it didn't. They then sat down in the next room and ate Zwetschgenkuchen. Nobody spoke. That is, not until Oma tried to go upstairs, and after a good-natured joke about all the toys Opa has left out on the stairs, became very serious. She muttered something to herself that Lina couldn't hear. What Lina did hear was the cabinet door opening, and the stubborn drawer coming out, and everything going back again. After which Oma appeared at the foot of the stairs. She frowned at each of them, Vati, Mutti, and Lina, until she saw they were looking. Then she smiled, but rather as if she were doing it in a snowstorm, and asked Vati,
"Bertie, mein Engel, have you seen the key?"
Vati looked into a space between all the visible things in the room. He did not ask what key. He hadn't seen it in years, he said. Before Oma even asked Mutti, they were both looking at Lina. This was a problem, because Lina knew exactly what key they wanted, and now she knew it was important, and possibly the very thing she had not been meant to touch. So the best she could do was to say,
"I don't have it, truly."
They spent another half-hour tidying the house, while Oma went through all her clothes. For once, Lina's impression that people were looking at her all the time was absolutely, uncomfortably true. The following day, Opa died. There was a funeral 3 days afterward, and Lina stood in silence during the service as Opa's box was lowered down. She sat in silence during the Leichenschmaus, listening to the half-false encomium of Opa's not-quite friends with leaden, crippling feeling that she and he were both being violated. She was half sure that Opa had the key with him, under the grass, and she was half certain she wanted to be there rather than here. Perhaps now that things were different, he would tell her why the thing was so important if only he could. Perhaps they could tell her. And so she waited for a lull in the conversation and said it.
Why is the key important?
She could tell instantly who knew what she meant and who did not. And everyone who did know tried to shut her up. Her family mostly, and one or two others, began talking all at once, and she couldn't make out any kind of answer apart from one very terrified injunction of her mother.
You mustn't ever talk about that.
Oma had said nothing. Her eyes quivered like a violin string, and when the first clamour had died away, a sound came from her throat like water that cannot escape the seeping drain. All she could manage was,
Did you take it?
Lina had not seen her Oma like this. She shook her head, but found that she, too, could not speak. It was midnight before they arrived home. Lina prepared for bed and found her parents unusually observant. They were too tired to reproach her, but Vati came to tuck her in, a thing he had not done in years. Once she lay there, grappling with the blanket. He still stood fumbling with the wooden post at the foot of the bed, tapping it, twisting his palm over it, humming, but not a song. Lina had been going to ask, "What is it?" but she knew. And now she thought she didn't want to know more, so she stopped herself saying anything. Vati finally satisfied himself with the words, "We're just in the next room." And when he left, the lights were off, the room became itself, and it pulled down even the moonlight into its void. And it was in that void that Lina slept. She dreamt of the other house, of the rooms above the stairs, and the odd things in them, of the dust, and the curio, and the drawer, and the key. And in her dream she had taken it. She had cradled it in her fingers, then heavy in her pocket, then it was staring at her from her purse, then her table. And then she had brought it into bed and was lying on top of it, the coal of black iron against her back. And when she awoke, she knew she had not taken it, but had to be sure, and threw on the light, that lying, pretending light in the real black room, and ripped away the blankets, the pillow, searching, sure that she would find it, until, at last, she didn't. Lina slept without the blankets. When next they visited the old house, it was to move everything out. Oma was going to live with them now, and so anything of importance was put on one truck and everything else on another. Lina helped when she could, but for an hour in the middle, when the heavy things came out, she was useless. So she pawed at the book she couldn't understand and found some handwritten notes. This wasn't unusual. Opa had annotated everything. He enjoyed it. But for some reason he had not written in German this time. Just then the curio itself came out. The gentlemen who were helping said it was ludicrously heavy considering it was empty, and asked what glass it was made of, and who had made it, and where to put it. Vati had been about to say, Oma stopped him.
Let it stay,
she told him.
Let it stay here.
The helpers looked at Vati. He hesitated, but he agreed. They put it back, in through the house, huffing and puffing up the stairs, into its corner, and Lina found she had been following them, and was standing at it still, much later when she was wanted. She looked round at the empty house. Come on, said Vati, glaring at the cabinet in warning, and then, Come, Lina, when she didn't move. The trucks were away and the rubbish sorted, and everyone in the car, when Lina realized she had not been into every room. She was certain she had left the light on in Opa's room, the one lamp next to the bed with the clean sheets, which was absurd because that was the room she had not been into. She insisted on making a last trip inside, and she was running for the door even as Mutti was calling to her.
The lamp is here with us. You can't have left it on.
And Vati was shouting, Lina, it's locked. Wait a moment. And as he fumbled in his pocket for the keys, and Mutti wrenched at the car door because it would not open, Oma watched, her mouth going dry, as Lina tried the door of the house, and when it would not open either, put her hand unthinking into her pocket, and lifted out a key. And she tried it in the lock to which it did not fit. But she did not know, or would not, that it was not for this door, and she turned the key anyway, and the door did not stop her. She thought that it opened. She thought that she walked into the house and it was full again, and that she went into the other room where Opa had been sleeping. She thought she saw the bed empty, and no bed at all. She thought that the room was full of light, real afternoon light, and that there was no room and no walls, but instead that she stood on a rutted road in a handsome country village deep in the mountains someplace, and not in einem Doppelhaus in a stained, unyielding city street, or rectangles and cars. And she thought that in front of her she saw a man clothed in armour inlaid with the stuff of myth, fit for a king if it were not so gouged and rusted, and beneath it a colourful but threadbare jacket, the sort that was usual hundreds of years ago, but only comes out during holiday celebrations. And when the man turned to meet her, he blenched, as one who had been struck by a friend without warning. But then pressing on, he said, "So you have found the key, mein Engel, and you have turned it in the lock that is not." Lina didn't question him. She couldn't. Her lips seemed to be stuck. She looked round at the cottages, and at the dusty track that led into the mountains, and at the crumbling fortress among the crags. And she looked at the villagers and their queer beauty, and at the deference they showed to the man in front of her, even as they all began to gather round the two of them. She had a notion that she knew this man, had seen him in a storybook or the like, and if she had fully remembered our stained, unyielding world, the notion that scratched at the window of her mind would have broken through, and she would have known it was Opa, though he was younger, and wore a beard and scars, and his hair was long and black. But she was in between, and remembered only the ideas and commotions of our sphere, and not its substance. And yet, now something happened. She recognized one of the villagers, a girl about her age, with flowers in her hair and on her sleeves, and with a bizarrely puckish grin. Lina knew the girl was whip-smart, and liked animals and play-acting, to be out of doors. She couldn't remember her name, but she remembered other things. She'd had a terrible time, this girl, with a certain batch of children her age, only not the age she was now, but the age she had been. That she had been when they teased her and threatened her, and made her do vile things. And then she had disappeared. Hadn't she? She had gone somewhere, someplace, forever. But she was here. The girl sprang into Lina's arms, and they both held on and cried about what they could not quite recall, only that they had both been sure of never seeing one another again. They were telling each other their names. The girl was called Shial, and both were quite certain that the names did not fit, when the man who was Opa broke in. "Lina, Liebchen, your time here may be brief, and I want to show you something." He began to lead her along the path into the mountains, but she pulled away. "Will I see my friend again?" she asked doubtfully. Both girls looked to the man. "Well," he said, raising his eyebrows, "why don't you both come?" And they went. In the great stone fastness that stretched along the slopes there was a noble hall, entirely stone and timber, and there were servants, but the sort who really are more like family. The man who was Opa was effusively grateful, if not embarrassed, to receive their help. And a fire was going, and there were several tapestries hung, half covering the walls. There, the man who was Opa told Lina who he was. She did not quite believe him, and yet she knew he would not lie. He said that in another world he'd had another name and a family, and that she'd been a part of it. And he'd loved her very much, but that now he would live here, and here only. Lina, whose dear friend Shial insisted on calling her Farsh, looked round, and was not surprised. It was a grand place. "You were the lord of this place?" she asked. Her answer was not immediate. "So long as I defend it," he said at last. "And who are these people to you? Are they also family?" The man, Opa, puffed a little puff, as if to say it was only a difficult thing, and it was. But Shial relieved him of the burden. "We belong here. We're of the same kind," she said. "As for the fortress, Lord Farmeran built it, with his spear." Lina looked at them both for an explanation. There was none. "I'll show you," said the Opa man, and he led the way out of the hall. They entered a corridor copiously decorated, and kept on. "You will need to see all this anyway, though I can't be sure when you'll return. In this room to the right is—" He went on describing things, but Lina was bewildered. She couldn't recall this world or the other one, not really. but it struck her that all the decorations in the corridor were of everyday things, and there were so many, some of them hanging, some on pedestals. Here was a plaster or bandage. Over there a printed assignment in very poor German with notes all over it. Farther along, a slice of birthday cake. And none of these things had spoiled in the usual way. But Lina was most decidedly arrested by a large plank with a gob of metal hammered into it. What you might call a railway sleeper, or a railroad tie. She reached out for it and was positively pierced to the marrow by an unabating, uncontrollable grief. She very nearly fell to the floor, weeping, but in that moment Chial returned to find her.
"Fash,"
she said.
"Oh, you remember."
She did not remember. She only felt.
"This one's mine,"
her friend prompted. For a reason hidden to Lina, the admission horrified her, and Chial could see it.
"It doesn't matter,"
she insisted, shaking her head.
"Follow me. Come on, we'll show you."
And at the very end of the gallery was a thick wooden door with rivets all over it, which Opa, or Lord Farmeron, opened. Still choking down sobs, Lina let the touch of Chial's hand guide her in and through the sorrow. And inside she found a turret room, cylindrical and colonnaded, and thoroughly festooned with what appeared to be weapons and armour.
"This is the armory," Lord Opa confirmed. "In it are all the slings and arrows which we may use against the trespassing horde."
At this, a woolly sort of feeling descended on Lina. It wasn't the over-elegant language that subdued her only, but a sense of inexorable dread, as she'd felt when she knew she'd been caught in making a very poor decision and there would be consequences. She gazed open-mouthed at the trove of swords and maces, helmets and shields, and only stared, glassy-eyed, when Lord Opa laid hold of a great and graceful spear with a much-scarred, leaf-shaped head, and told how it had come to him first. She listened woodenly as Chial recounted how she had chosen and used her bow. And she gaped foggily, for it was all she could do, when the man, she had forgotten who he was, told her she might use any of them she pleased. It was at this point that, cradling Lina's shoulders, Chial told Lord Farmeron,
"Something's the matter."
And recognizing the moment for what it was, Lord Opa Farmeron took her face in his enormous hands and charged her, in no uncertain terms, to
"Remember this room. Remember this door, this place. Remember your friends as they are here. For when you find them elsewhere, they will be disguised, and it will stifle every good instinct, unless you open this door."
He had not finished when a gasping servant rushed in to tell them,
"The things are on the move,"
at which Lord Opa shouted some sort of oath and ended with, "Take this," handing her a sort of long-handled axe,
"and use it. Promise me on your life that you will not ever, despair."
And as the three of them raced back to the corridor, to the hall, and outside, she watched his face. She knew his face. It was all she knew. And she saw him look out at the villagers thronging in for protection, and out at the distant hills where a hot wind stirred, and where a trickling, falling, overflowing cascade of some things hurried along the dips and rises. She peered in a half-swoon at the others gathering left and right, so familiar, beloved, and wholly unknown, each with their weapons, armour, and a grim look. Then the some things came farther, closer in, and they closed on the wall. They climbed it, covering it in a black blanket, and snarling as the arrows punched home, they came on doggedly until they neared the top. And Lina began to know their language. It was everyone's, and her own. And as the wretches topped the battlements, their howls became clear. They cried less of killing, and more of lies, and lustre, and lust, and all that was dust. Each person tore into the beasts, Lina with her axe, the man with his spear, and others along the wall, but they were soon overwhelmed and trampled, and many were eaten, and the creatures scattered further in, chasing down their prey. Now she was bloody, half-mangled, 100 times wounded, but somehow she lived, and saw the man beside her cackle and grin through ochre-stained teeth, and stand up upon the wall without half his body to rely on, and command all those who did the same,
"Now! They are in the heart of our fastness. Let us eat all our failures and make them fear the coming of the Farmeron."
A shout went up. Lina, if that's who she was, could not hear it.
"Up!"
shouted a girl beside her.
"Get up!"
But she was not there. She was in a car.
It would be wrong to suppose that she remembered that world. But she did remember, as the car trundled homeward, with her parents and Oma and lamps and bits and bobs, all its ideas and commotions, though without its substance. She was in between, and nobody appeared quite what they were. And it would be wrong to suppose that it did not happen again. It happened as she returned to school. It happened in her bedroom, and at the grocer's, and even at the club. And at each place, when she met a person, she sometimes knew their likeness already, saw a weapon in their hands, and the horde all round them. And she saw them everywhere, even when she married, and had children. And as she seized each one, wrapped it into her body, she saw them as they were and would be, newly born, but known already fighting, bloody, and brave. For oftentimes they lived as their mother had done, in between, carrying two worlds and their two kinds of scars, though she had tried to hide the key. I hope you really enjoyed that story. Thank you for listening to it. By all means, listen to / watch our discussion video where we talk about some of the whys and hows of this story. Thanks very much. Truly, thank you for listening to it or watching or both. There's a link somewhere to the discussion video. Find the link! Find the link! Is it there? I don't know.